How do we act when we forthrightly acknowledge that evil is as much within us, the undoubted bearers of virtue, as it is within our more benighted opponents? How do we act if we also acknowledge the equal power of good and evil? Or to be more precise, how do we act when we acknowledge the equal but differential power of good and evil? Just as evil and force can readily destroy a social order, yet cannot establish a lasting peace, the good so patiently achieved can readily be undone, not only by cruelty, domination, resentment, and fear, but by the dual temptations of undue self-satisfaction and the unwitting imposition of yesterday's solutions on today's challenges.
Do you think that we are in a place where we can begin to hold the injustice and suffering around identity differently than we have been doing it? It's a different time. We need to own our identities differently.
The excitement that we're trying to do in the work we're doing together at Meadville is trying to find how do we at the same time acknowledge the way we let each other down. And so move from a kind of cross-cultural awareness to cross-cultural collaboration. How do we hold the times that we do fall short, that we make terrible mistakes, and yet find the resilience to stay together and learn from those? And so what I see is as a time, and especially if we could move into a kind of non-dualistic logic of good and evil, there will be the possibility of not, okay, now this is an odd thing to say, not feeling undue shame when those of us who are privileged make mistakes, but feeling a resolute accountability to learn from those and try to put the structures so they won't happen again, and have the resilience and grace to accept it and learn from it.
I think I'm probably an unreconstructed Western dualist. And so, Sharon, as I've read your stuff over the years, and you keep coming at me with the non-dualism of good and evil, and I keep scratching my head. And I thought to myself, finally I have a chance to ask her in person about the non-dualism of good and evil. And then Rebecca's piece also talked about confronting evil but not hating evil. And I thought, what does it mean to not hate evil? But then, Sharon, you just helped me realize that I'd already discovered the answer myself, though I hadn't realized it. And I want to thank you for that. And it's around the issue. It's through my struggles to build multiracial, multicultural community that and to come to terms with my own complicity in oppression, and my getting over my own reactions of always focusing the hate and the shame back on myself around that stuff and then projecting it back out on everyone else as well, that I had come myself to realize how not to hate evil, but to clearly and calmly resist it. But I didn't discover that until right now, and I want to thank you for that.
As a leader working hard to develop skills of ministry in a multicultural congregation, Rob Hardees has discovered through his own experience that suddenly he's lived into a less dualistic understanding of good and evil, one that had previously eluded him. I believe that this shift is probably the most critical thing we need to do if we're to be effective in this work towards justice. Particularly as privileged people, we need to learn to accept that no matter how good our intentions, we've received benefits from being in a dominant class, and that the privileges we've received have usually been at the expense of the historically marginalized peoples. If we only have categories of good and evil, we will run as fast as we can from the notion of being bad with all of the shame and guilt that that word induces. We'll block out any road that might possibly lead us there. What stories help us to move forward with our own institutional history around racism, to accept that we're a movement of both abolitionists and slave ship captains, liberators and oppressors.
We need to make room in our story for not just past successes and failures, but for the challenges of our current context. Making room will require changing some of our language of self-identity. To describe Unitarian Universalism as a predominantly white faith is accurate, but not helpful. The phrase contains not one iota of our aspirations and locks us in a spirit-deadening acceptance of demographic determinism. What is our story about Unitarian Universalism and race? And what story do we need? We need to claim a story of struggle, an unabashedly religious story that can name our successes and our failures, our courage and our cowardice, our sacrifice and our privilege. That story will be aspirational, for at times we have retreated from the call of justice. Yet over the long haul, we have always re-engaged. Our story of struggle is grounded in our faith, values, and tradition, taking the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the fundamental reality of our interconnectedness not as idle phrases, but calls to action. This story of struggle will not only put our history in perspective, but also empower us to face the day ahead. The two current Unitarian Universalist stories have left us divided. Some of us, probably most, choose the Selma narrative of success, but know in our hearts that our work is far from done. Others find it hard to honor the courage that is legitimately a part of our history. Even worse, among my generation, feelings are still so strong that even discussing our history feels dangerous. We need a story that brings us together. How that story will be written is our choice.
How will you find the words to tell the next chapter of your story? Hopefully we'll do it together, for we must each hear each other in order to know our whole story.
I don't know how one repairs something that's more than 500 years old. And what I realize, and we keep saying we can't train racism away, there are no checklists, but something in Victoria's story reminded me of what Sherilyn Ifill says, and she says all stories about racism are local stories. And so any stories that we will have around reconciliation have to start with what is the racial reality where we are? What is that history? Who are the people there? And how are we going to start making relationship with the people where we are? So there's no one answer, but I'd say whatever it is, it's where you are in your city and the people there and how you start reaching across those boundaries to form those relationships and find out what that looks like to them where they are.